João Belchior Marques Goulart was a Brazilian politician who served as the 24th president of Brazil until a military coup d'etat deposed him on April 1, 1964. He is considered to have been the last left-wing president of the country until Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva took office in 2003. Name: João Goulart was nicknamed Django. The Janio Quadros João Goulart presidential bid was thus called January to January. His childhood nickname was Janguinho, which came from an uncle named Django. Years later, when he entered the world of politics, he was supported and advised by Getulio Vargas, and his friends and colleagues started to call him Django. His grandfather, Belchior Rodrigues Goulart, descended from Portuguese immigrants from the Azores who arrived in Rio Grande do Sul in the second half of the 18th century. There were at least 3 immigrants with the surname Goulart of Flemish Azorian origins in the group of first Azorians established in the state. Early life: Goulart was born at Igariaca Farm, in what used to be the district but is now the town of Itacaúbe, São Borja, Rio Grande do Sul, on March 1, 1918. His parents were Vicentina Marques Goulart, housewife, and Vicente Rodrigues Goulart, estanciero and colonel of the National Guard during the 1932 revolution, who fought on the side of Governor Borges de Medeiros. Most sources indicate that João was born in 1918, but his birth year is actually 1919. This occurred because his father ordered a second birth certificate in which he added 1 year to his son's age so that João could attend the law school at Rio Grande do Sul Federal University. When João was born, the Igariaca farm was an isolated location in the municipality of São Borja. Due to isolation, his mother had no medical care during childbirth, only the aid of her mother Maria Tomás Vasquez Marques. According to João's sister Yolanda, my grandmother was the one able to revive little João, who, at birth, already looked like dying. Like most Azorian descendants, Maria Tomás was a devout Catholic. While trying to revive her grandson, warming him, she prayed to John the Baptist. She promised the saint that if the newborn boy were to survive, he would be named after him and would not have his hair cut until the age of 3, when he would follow the procession of June 24 dressed up as the saint. João grew up as a skinny boy in Igariaca, alongside his 5 sisters, Eufrides, Maria, Yolanda, Sila, and Noisa. Both his younger brothers died prematurely. Rivadavia died 6 months after birth, and Ivan, to whom he was deeply attached, died of leukemia at 33. João left for the nearby town of Itaquí to study. The decision of his father Vicente to form a partnership with Protásio Vargas, brother of Getulio, after both leased a small refrigerator house in that town from an English businessman. While Vicente ran the business for the following couple of years, João attended the school of the Teresian sisters, along with his sisters. Although it was a mixed-sex school during the day, he could not stay the night at the boarding school with his sisters but had to sleep at the house of a friend of his father. It was in Itaquí that João developed a taste for both soccer and swimming. Upon his return to São Borja, ending his experience as a partner in the refrigerator house, Vicente decided to send João to attend the Ginásio Santana, run by the Marist brothers in Uruguaiana. João attended first to the 4th grade in the Santana boarding school, but failed to be approved for the 5th grade in 1931. Angry with his son's poor achievements at school, Vicente decided to send him to attend the Colegio Anchieta in Porto Alegre. In the state capital, João lived at a pension with friends Almir Palmeiro and Abade dos Santos Ayub, the latter very attached to him. Aware of João's skills in soccer at school, where he played in the right-back position, Almirante Abade convinced him to take a test for Sports Club International. João was selected for the club's juvenile team. In 1932, he became a juvenile state champion. The same year he finished the third grade of the Inácio at Colégio Anchieta, with an irregular academic achievement, which would be repeated when he attended the law school at Rio Grande do Sul Federal University. João graduated from high school at Inácio Santana after being sent back to Uruguay. Political career. Sent back to Porto Alegre after graduating from high school, João attended law school to satisfy his father, who desired to see his son with a higher education degree. While there, João restored contact with his youth friends Abade Uban Salvador Aricio, and secured new friendships, making his first excursions in the state capital's nightlife. It was during the time of a bohemian lifestyle that João acquired a venereal disease, which paralyzed his left knee almost entirely. His family paid for expensive medical treatment, including a trip to São Paulo, but he expected that he would never walk normally again. Because of the paralysis of his knee, João graduated separately from the rest of his class in 1939. He would never really act as a lawyer. Soon after graduating, João returned to São Paulo. His depression because of the leg problem was visible. He isolated himself from the rest of the city at Igariaca farm. According to his sister Yolanda, his depression did not last long. In the early 1940s he decided to make fun of his own walking disability in the carnival, participating in the parade of the block Comigo Ninguém Pode. Beginning at PTB, his father died in 1943, leaving the responsibility of taking care of his rural properties to João. João soon became one of the most influential estancieros of the region. Upon the resignation of President Getulio Vargas and his return to São Paulo in October 1945, João was already a wealthy man. He did not need to enter politics to rise socially, but the frequent meetings with Vargas, a close friend of his father, were decisive in João's pursuit of a public life. The first invitation João received to enter a political party was made by Protásio Vargas, Getulio's brother, which was in charge of organizing the Social Democratic Party in São Paulo. Protásio realized that João could succeed in the world of politics, but João declined. Months later, however, he accepted Getulio's invitation to join the Brazilian Labour Party. He was the first president of the local PTB, and would later become statewide and nationwide president of the party. In 1947, Getulio convinced João to run for a seat in the state assembly. He was elected with 4,150 votes, becoming the fifth top voted out of 23 deputies. He received more votes than his future brother-in-law Leonel Brizola, another rising star of the PTB, who was married to his sister Noisa until her death in 1993. João was not an active member of the assembly, but fought for the right of the needy to buy cheaper food. He soon became a confidant and political protégé of Vargas, becoming one of the party members who most insistently urged him to launch a presidential candidacy for the 1950 elections. On April 19, 1949, João launched Getulio's candidacy for president at a birthday party held for the former president at Granja São Vicente, owned by Goulart. In 1950, Goulart was elected to the Chamber of Deputies. He received 39,832 votes, becoming the second top-voted candidate of PTB on Rio Grande do Sul. João took office as a federal deputy on February 1951, but soon asked for temporary resignation from his term to become Secretary of the Interior and Justice in the administration of Rio Grande do Sul. Sal, Governor Ernesto Dornelles. During his time as secretary, which lasted until March 24, 1952, Django engaged in restructuring the prison system, intending to improve the living conditions of the prisoners. He later resigned his job as secretary at the request of Vargas in order to help the president with a political deadlock at the Ministry of Labor, using his influence on the labor union movement. Minister of Labor. In 1953, after becoming aggravated with the deadlock, Vargas appointed Django as the Minister of Labor. The Vargas administration was in a deep crisis. The workers, unsatisfied with the low wages, were promoting strikes, and the right-wing party National Democratic Union was mobilizing a coup d'état among the mass media, the upper middle class and the military forces. As he took office, Django had to reply to accusations from several newspapers, including the New York Times. As Minister of Labor, Goulart held the first Brazilian Congress of Social Security. He signed a series of decrees favoring the Social Security, such as housing financing, regulation of loans by the Institute of Retirement and Pensions of bank employees, and recognizing the employees of the Audit Committee of the Institute of Retirement and Pensions of Industry Employees. In January 1954, Django began studies for the review of the minimum wage, facing two types of pressure. On the one hand, the mobilization of workers in larger cities to claim a readjustment of 100% that would increase the minimum wage from CR $1,200 to CR $2,400, and on the other hand, the rejection by entrepreneurs of the policy of reviewing the wage since the Eurico Gaspar Dutra administration, which contributed to the impoverishment of several segments of the Brazilian society. The business community said it would agree with a 42% raise on the minimum wage, a measure, according to them, that would match the cost of living in 1951. On May Day, Vargas signed into law the new minimum wage, a 100% increase as demanded by the working class. Django resigned as Minister of Labor on February 1954, passing the job to his legal substitute Hugo de Faria, and resumed his term as federal deputy. Among the reasons for his resignation was the strong reaction of the mass media and the military forces against the new minimum wage. The political crisis of the Vargas administration deepened after one of his bodyguards was involved in an assassination attempt against UDN leader Carlos Lacerda on August 5, 1954. Vargas was put under pressure by the media, which demanded his resignation. The pro-coup movement at the military was public. On August 24, 1954, at 1 a.m., Vargas called Django on Cartete Palace and handed him a document to be read only after he arrived in Rio Grande do Sul. It was his suicide letter. Vice President. After Vargas' suicide, Django thought about leaving politics forever. However, at the president's burial on August 26, 1954, he seemed to have given up the idea, declaring that we, within the law and order, will know how to fight with patriotism and dignity, inspired by the example that you left us. In October 1954, there were elections for the Federal Senate, the Chamber of Deputies, state governments, and state assemblies. The second half of the year started off with uncertainties for the PTB and its allies. Emotionally and politically shaken by attacks made by Vargas' rivals, Django departed from political activities for a few weeks. He only returned after a series of meetings with PTB leaders in Rio Grande do Sul. By the end of these meetings, it was decided that Django would run for the Senate. However, both Jango and fellow PTB leader Rai Ramos were defeated. The PTB also lost the gubernatorial election in Rio Grande do Sul, although it was able to elect a large number of deputies in both the State Assembly and Chamber of Deputies. On November 1954, the PTB and PSD began to discuss an electoral coalition for the 1955 elections. Minas Gerais Governor Juscelino Kubitschek was PSD's big bet for the presidency. On November 7, Kubitschek gave an interview suggesting a coalition between the two parties. His candidacy was approved by the Minas Gerais branch of the party at the end of November. After this, the discussions began as to who would run as his vice-presidential candidate. After troubled negotiations, João Goulart, whom he had initially proposed, was chosen. The PSD National Convention was held on February 10, 1955, with the confirmation of Kubitschek as the party's presidential candidate. Meanwhile, Vargas Vice President Café Filho formed a government with several UDN ministers, which impeded governance, and proved himself uncommitted with the latter president's government plans. On December 1954, Juarez Tavora, his chief of military staff, threatened to veto Jango as a vice-presidential candidate. In April 1955, the National Directory of PSD accepted the nomination of Jango, and in the same month, the alliance was approved by the PTB National Convention. The candidacy was ready but vulnerable to new vetoes of Jango in the military and among dissident leaders of PSD. After the PTB National Convention, a letter from Brazilian Communist Party leader Luiz Carlos Prestes to Jango was published in the press. In the letter, Prestes suggested that PTB and PCB could work together for the benefit of the Brazilian population. That was enough to intensify the actions of those plotting a coup. In addition to the smear campaign run by Carlos Lacerda in his newspaper Tribuna da Imprensa and the usual plotting inside the military, April ended with a statement by former President Dutra in a Globo that he personally opposed Jango's candidacy. From the institutional point of view, the crisis did not have major repercussions, and the PSD ratified its support for João Goulart as running mate of Juscelino Kubitschek in a convention in June. Even with the dissent of the party in Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, and Pernambuco. In 1956, Goulart was elected vice president, as the running mate of President Juscelino Kubitschek. Goulart was again elected vice president in 1960. This time, however, the president was Jânio Quadros, a member of a different party. At the time, Brazilians could vote for a ticket that had candidates for president and vice president from different parties. Quadros resigned in 1961, according to some chroniclers, as an attempt to promote a self-coup. The Goulart administration. Goulart was out of the country on a state visit to China when Quadros resigned. Several political and military elements thought Goulart was too radical for the presidency. They objected to his left-wing tendencies, his nationalist policies, and his willingness to seek closer relations with communist countries. These elements called for the vice presidency to be declared vacant and new elections could be held. Congress was initially reluctant to recognize Goulart as president. He returned to Brazil a few days after Quadros' resignation, insisting he was already president. A compromise was agreed upon, thanks to Leonel Brizola and the Cadeia de Legalidade, and Goulart was able to take the presidency, but with his powers constrained by a parliamentary system of government. A constitutional amendment was accordingly passed which transferred most of the president's powers to the newly created post of Prime Minister. Only after this amendment was Goulart allowed to take the oath of office as president, to serve as head of state only. Goulart nominated Tancred Neves for appointment as Prime Minister. During this period, Goulart and his Prime Minister chose the three-year plan as the economic plan of his government under the advisement of Celso Furtado, his Minister of Planning, in order to strengthen the energy sector and to foster Brazilian development. Eletrobras, Latin America's largest power utility company, was created in 1962, as part of the compromise that installed a parliamentary system of government in 1961. A plebiscite was set for 1963 to confirm or reverse the changes made to the constitution. The parliamentary system of government was overwhelmingly rejected in the referendum, and Goulart assumed full presidential powers. The presidential government of Goulart, initiated in 1963, was marked politically by the administration's closer ties to center-left political groups, and conflict with more conservative sectors of the society, specifically the National Democratic Union. Goulart also led Brazil in the drive for a nuclear-free Latin America, providing the impetus for the Five Presidents' Declaration and the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Brazil's leadership on nuclear disarmament was a casualty of the military coup, and Mexico eventually stepped in to continue to drive for a nuclear-free region. Basic reforms. The main reason for Goulart's fall was his Basic Reforms Plan, a group of social and economic measures of nationalist character that predicted a greater state intervention in the economy. Among the reforms were education reform. It aimed to combat adult illiteracy with the widespread use of the pioneering teachings of Paulo Freire and his method. The government also proposed to hold a university reform and prohibited the operation of private schools. It was imposed that 15% of the income produced in Brazil would be directed to education. Tax reform. Control of any transfer of profits by multinational companies with headquarters abroad. The profit should be reinvested in Brazil. The income tax would be proportional to personal profit. Electoral reform. Extension of voting rights to illiterate people and low-ranking military officers. Land reform. Non-productive properties larger than 600 hectares would be expropriated and redistributed to the population by the government. At the time, the agricultural population was larger than the urban. The military coup. In the early hours of March 31, 1964, General Olimpio Moreira Filho, in charge of the 4th Military Region, headquartered in Juiz de Fora, Minas Gerais, ordered his troops to start moving towards Rio de Janeiro to depose Goulart. On April 1 at 12:45 p.m., João Goulart left Rio for the capital, Brasilia, in an attempt to stop the coup politically. When he reached Brasilia, Goulart realized he lacked any political support. The Senate President, Auro Moura Andrade, was already calling for congressional support of the coup. Goulart stayed for a short time in Brasilia, gathering his wife and 2 children, and flying to Porto Alegre in an Air Force Avra 748 aircraft. Soon after Goulart's plane took off, Auro Moura Andrade declared the position of President of Brazil vacant. In the first hours of April 2, Auro Moura de Andrade, along with the President of the Supreme Federal Court, swore in Pascoal Ranieri Mazzilli, the Speaker of the House, as President. This move was arguably unconstitutional at the time, as João Goulart was still in the country. At the same time, Goulart, now in the headquarters of the Third Army in Porto Alegre, still loyal to him at the time, contemplated resistance and counter-moves with Leonel Brizola, who argued for armed resistance. In the morning, General Floriano Machado informed the president that troops loyal to the coup were moving from Curitiba to Porto Alegre, and that he had to leave the country, otherwise risking arrest. At 11:45 a.m., Goulart boarded a Douglas C-47 transport for his farm bordering Uruguay. Goulart would stay on his farmland until April 4, when he finally boarded the plane for the last time, heading from Montevideo. The coup installed successive right-wing hardliners as heads of state who suspended civil rights and liberties of the Brazilian people. They abolished all political parties and replaced them with only two: the military government's party called the National Renewal Alliance Party and the consented opposition Brazilian Democratic Movement. The MDB, however, had no real power, and the military rule was marked by widespread disappearance, torture, and exile of many politicians, university students, writers, singers, painters, filmmakers, and other artists. President João Goulart was not favorably viewed in Washington. He took an independent stand in foreign policy, resuming relations with socialist countries and opposing sanctions against Cuba. His administration passed a law limiting the amount of profits multinationals could transmit outside the country, whose subsidiary of ITT was nationalized. He promoted economic and social reforms. Lincoln Gordon served as U.S. ambassador to Brazil, where he played a major role for the support of the opposition against the government of President João Goulart, and during the 1964 Brazilian coup d'etat. On March 27, 1964, he wrote a top-secret cable to the U.S. government, urging it to support the coup of Humberto de Alencar Castelo Branco with a clandestine delivery of arms and shipments of gas and oil, to possibly be supplemented by CIA covert operations. Gordon believed that Goulart, wanting to seize dictatorial power, was working with the Brazilian Communist Party. Gordon wrote, "If our influence is to be brought to bear to help avert a major disaster here which might make Brazil the China of the 1960s, this is where both I, and all my senior advisers believe our support should be placed." Quote, in the years after the coup, Gordon's staff, and the CIA repeatedly denied that they had been involved, and President Lyndon B. Johnson praised Gordon's service in Brazil as a rare combination of experience and scholarship, idealism and practical judgment. Quote, in 1976, Gordon stated that the Johnson administration had been prepared to intervene militarily to prevent a leftist takeover of the government, but did not directly state that it had or had not intervened. Circa 2004, many documents were declassified and placed online at the GWU National Security Archive, indicating the involvement of Johnson, McNamara, Gordon, and others. In 2005, Stansfield Turner's book described the involvement of ITT Corporation President Harold Janine and CIA Director John McCone. Attorney General Robert Kennedy was uneasy about Goulart allowing communists to hold positions in government agencies. U.S. President Lyndon Johnson and his Defense Secretary Robert S. McNamara were also worried. The president of ITT, Harold Janine, was friends with the Director of Central Intelligence, John McCone. The CIA performed psyops against Goulart, performed character assassination, pumped money into opposition groups, and enlisted the help of the Agency for International Development and the AFL-CIO. Life in exile. On April 4, 1964, Django and his family landed in Uruguay seeking political asylum. After his first years in Montevideo, he bought a farm in the Uruguay-Brazil border, where he devoted himself to farming cattle. On 1966 he took part in Frente Ampla political movement, which aimed to fight for the full restoration of democratic rule in Brazil through peaceful means. The end of Frente Ampla also resulted in the end of Django's political activity. He decided to focus in managing his farms located in Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina and Brazil. In late 1973, then Argentine President Juan Domingo Perón invited Django to live in Buenos Aires and asked him to collaborate on a plan to expand Argentine meat exports to Europe and other markets which would not traditionally buy the Argentine commodity. However, Perón's then Minister of Social Welfare and Private Secretary José López Rega opposed the designation. Nevertheless, Django decided to stay in Buenos Aires. In March 1976 in the town of La Plata, the Argentine army dismantled a group of right-wing terrorists planning to kidnap Django's son and demand a high ransom in cash. With his personal security compromised, the former president distanced himself from Buenos Aires. This experience led Django to arrange new steps for his safe return to Brazil. This was, however, delayed because of the proximity of the electoral campaign in November of that year.